Hello, I'm Michael Igel. I am the board chair of the Florida Holocaust Museum. I am also the chair of the Florida Department of Education Commissioner's Task Force on Holocaust Education. I am also the grandson, great nephew, and nephew of Holocaust survivors. And today I'm honored to be on such a special day, honored to be able to share with you my family's story and what it has meant to me. So as I mentioned, I'm the grandson of survivors, and my grandparents are from Poland, and they were farmers. And here you see from the photos that there's my grandfather in his army uniform with his mother. I always joke that right there you can see proof that I was not adopted. That is definitely the Eagle profile there. So, so that's my grandfather walking with his mother, and the other photo is of my great-grandfather, my grandfather's father. And it kind of, one of those things that gives you a reminder of how powerful, important, impactful, heavy it is to tell this kind of a story. That's the only photo that exists of my great-grandfather right there. So that's how I met him. And that's all we know of him, other than a letter that I'm going to show you as well. And here is a photo of my grandfather and one of his brothers. That's my great uncle Martin. And my grandfather's the one with his arm around his younger brother. My grandfather was one of four. He was the middle brother, so he had an older brother, Leon. You're going to hear about all these people. He had an older brother, Leon. He was Stanley, and he had a younger brother, Martin, and then they had a sister called Sala. And my grandparents were married the night that Hitler invaded Poland. And my grandfather was off to war on his wedding night. And then 2 days later, as Hitler took over Poland, he was back home, because that was a short battle, unfortunately. What you see here are letters. These are from my grandfather to his brother, Leon. Leon was in the United States for reasons that we're not fully certain of. Even his own children are not fully certain of. The most likely reason is that he was still recuperating from some wounds from World War I, coupled with he had graduated from medical school, which was quite a feat, being from a family of farmers, and was sort of doing he was going to America for his first time as a result of both of those things. And as the war broke out, he actually ended up stuck in America, started out sleeping on a park bench, actually, and we'll come back to him. But he kept these letters, and recently my mom and my dad found them in my parents' house, and we recently donated them to the museum because of their importance in the story. And as you can see here, for example, this is from, as I said, my grandfather to his brother. And they're very harrowing to read, to put it mildly. They talk about the beginnings of the struggles. This is 1940, so it says things are starting to deteriorate significantly. And he tells his brother that. And at the end, he even says, I know you're doing everything you can to help us and get us to the United States. I know you can't. People are traveling through Prague to get out. We can't get there. I know you're trying, but thank you for trying, and I love you, kind of thing. He also mentions that their mother is very sick, and that he's doing all he can. He's the one who's working as hard as he can to be able to afford medication for her. She ultimately died shortly thereafter. This letter here is from my great-grandfather. I mentioned all we have is the photo in this letter. And when it was translated by the museum's director of research and education, she commented on, she commented on the penmanship, which I completely agree with. It's absolutely beautiful. And as somebody who has terrible penmanship, I particularly respect it. But she also said it's clear that he was a farmer in terms of his grammar. His grammar wasn't perfect, but that would be consistent, sort of with a farmer, without the heavy amount of formal education, but also that it's incredibly poetic, and that it was clear how much he loved his family. which I think is sweet, because this is this is a letter from my great-grandfather to his son, Leon, who again is trapped in New York, essentially with nothing. And in here, he notifies Leon that his mother has died. One thing that I feel a lot of emotion for is how tied they were to their Judaism. I wasn't aware just how tied they were to their traditions. I knew that my grandparents were, because I grew up in that sort of a family, and still hold the traditions to be very important and sacred. But I was particularly heartened to see that went back even a generation farther than I even knew. And this is a photo of their grave. Many Jewish graves in the Holocaust were obviously desecrated during the Holocaust or after. And in the early 90s, I was lucky enough to go back to Poland with my grandparents for their first time back. It must have been special for them to bring their children and their grandchildren with them. And we actually found their gravesite, and a big portion of it, as you can see, was already, it is still there. Some of it had been destroyed, but the core of it is still there. Ultimately, my great-grandfather was also killed during the Holocaust, and my grandfather and his brother buried him when he was killed, and then ultimately exhumed him and brought him to be at rest with his wife, ultimately, and that's where they rest now. So a very important place, and I'm heartened to know that at least the stone is still there. I mentioned also they had a sister. She's in the sort of purple dress there. That's my Aunt Sala. She deserves such a special place in our story, which I'll get back to the core of shortly. She was the mother of two, and her husband was a sort of like some sort of city council member who was arrested one day and never seen or heard from again, gone. She became a single mom, hoping she'd see her husband again, but of course that never happened. I'll get to her portion of the story and her children shortly, but these letters were sent to my Uncle Leon when she was sent to Siberia area in Russia. And these are letters where she refers to her own children as orphans. She's just under the assumption she's not going to make it. And this is, as you can see on the top, in 1943. So sort of, in the throes of things. And then another one here towards the end of the war, where she's asking her brother if he knows what has happened to their family, and even says, I have no idea what I'll come home to, if anything. And so you can just, the despair in these is just particularly significant and heavy. And these also, just to share a little bit more on the artifact side of things, and then we'll just get briefly into the story as well. These you can see are dated in 1947. These are evidence of the efforts that were taken by my family, but also lots of people like my family, in trying to get their things back, because everything was taken from them. And this is evidence of the efforts they were taking in order to have their property given back to them, because their farm was taken, all of their possessions were taken. And it's actually a fight that my brother and my cousins and I continue to fight to this day, in an effort to honor our family and what is ours. I also wanted to just share, these are copies of the receipts that my uncle kept, and you can see there's some Russian up at the top there. My great uncle Leon did everything he could to help his family, even when he didn't know where they were precisely and what their condition was. And here's some just evidence of him trying to get materials and items to his family. One of those letters, the one from my great-grandfather, just has him begging his own son for underwear, if he can get underwear. And again, that's towards the beginning of the war. Obviously, the correspondence ceased as things got worse. My grandparents, as I said, were farmers. My grandfather was able to get a job. They were placed into the ghetto, like many Jews, as things deteriorated more and more and more. I will say full circle, just because of the time, they're from a city or kind of town called Shemesh. And if anybody's been watching the news, that's one of the main areas where refugees are currently being housed and cared for in the Ukrainian conflict. And so it's very special for me to see such good things happening for people in a place where horrible things happen to my family, but also wonderful things that I'll get into. And also Lvov, the letters mention Lvov, which is now Lviv. And so it's interesting and kind of emotionally heavy to see all of this activity in those areas. So my grandparents had a little baby girl at the time, my Aunt Tony, and they were placed in the ghetto, forced into the ghetto like so many other Jews. And while they were there, they were walking with my aunt sort of at the edge of the ghetto, and a stranger came up to them and said, no baby should be in there. And my grandfather took a huge risk, and my grandmother too. This would have been punishable by death just to ask, but he took a deep breath and he said, will you help us? Had she been like most people, she would have probably ratted them out and they probably would have been killed. She said, meet me here tomorrow. And the next day they met this stranger and they gave their baby to her in the hopes that they could save their baby. My aunt was given false papers and lived under a false identity. And thankfully, she survived. And ultimately, as my grandparents survived, they were reunited with her. So very just special circumstance that showed a lot of strength and courage, both on my grandparents' side and the lady who agreed to take her. Her last name was Konyosna, very special person. My grandfather, as I mentioned, he obviously knew how to ride a horse. So he was able to find a job teaching a very high-ranking Nazi official's wife how to ride a horse. And this Nazi was, as my grandfather would describe him to my brother and me, sort of like the devil personified, just an absolutely horrible person who would, just for sport, indiscriminately go through the ghetto and just shoot people, beat them, throw them up against walls, crush skulls, horrible, horrible things. And his wife, the way it was described to me, was the opposite. She was just a good person. And to think about the strength she showed when she was almost done learning from my grandfather, she told my grandfather, you need to escape because my husband's going to kill you when you're done teaching me. And to be married to such a vile human being and be so wonderful, I think shows a tremendous amount of strength in this commandant's wife. Her last name was Schwamberger. And he ultimately was found in Argentina about 30 years later, was extradited to Germany and was tried and convicted for his crimes, thankfully. My grandparents were going to testify at the trial, but they received death threats and ended up being unable to travel to be able to do it. This is back in the early 90s. And so they got this wind that they needed to get out of there. So my grandfather, his brother, Martin, the one that was there, my grandmother, his wife, of course, and their father, because the mother had already been killed, all found a way, for the sake of brevity, found a way to escape the ghetto and ended up hiding out in the forest. And they were shepherded from different farms to barns and farms and hidden in the forest and kind of moved around a lot for safety. And many of them, if not all of them, were not Jews. They were just people doing the right thing at incredible risks to themselves and their families. Again, these were acts that were punishable by death. And these people were just focused on doing the right thing, which I think is the lesson, one of the main lessons of my story, my existence, my family story. One such family was Michal and Katerina Garula. And there's a photo of them being held up by their son. And they had 3 children, as you can see there. And they were simple farmers as well. And my grandparents did not know them very well. The families didn't really know each other very well or anything. They were just kind of in the town together. And they were one of the families that were hiding my grandparents. And at the time, my grandparents were hiding. It was my grandfather, my grandmother, again, my Uncle Martin, and their father. So 4 of them and 3 other Jews. as this part of the story takes shape. And it's the dead of winter in Poland. It's late December. And the one day they're hiding in a barn, and one day Michal, the husband, Garula, comes in and says, you know, we were in church for New Year's, it was New Year's Eve, and somebody told us, was going around telling everybody that we were hiding Jews, and I just want you to know for your safety that people are talking, but I don't put a lot of stock in it. Nobody listens to that lady, nobody trusts her, we should be okay. My grandfather was a little concerned for himself and his family, but also for the Garulas, and he said, you know, let's go ahead and go somewhere else for the night. And so they were moved to another place. He left a bag there hidden because they intended to come back. Unfortunately, the next day, the police showed up at the barn. They ransacked the Garula's house. Remember, they have 3 children there. This is all in front of their children. They then went into the barn and found the other 3 Jews. They made them dig their own graves, and they shot them on the spot. And they then ransacked the barn and found the bag. They arrested the Garulas on the spot, leaving their 3 children there. While they were imprisoned, they were tortured for 6 weeks, and there were demands for them to give up where my family was, because again, they knew that there were more people, and they did not give them up. They were executed for it. Sorry. I can't imagine. They orphaned 3 children, all to do the right thing. So, I'm here because they did that. And through the efforts of the museum, very recently, about 1.5 years ago, we were able to actually find that one of the children was still alive. The son there was still alive, who's holding the picture of his parents. Through an unbelievable story that if I had more time, I'd share how it was accomplished. But it's pretty unbelievable. But we were given the opportunity to actually Skype with the son, and it was an unbelievable, life-changing experience. And then, believe it or not, just a few weeks later, he passed away. So it was unbelievable that we had the opportunity that we had, the time we had to share with him how thankful we were. And that's why I'm here today, because it's a promise to my grandparents and to him that what was done wasn't in vain. Through some, excuse me, recent work at the museum, as well as we continue to work on our family story, we also learned of, and through the discussions with the son, we also learned of a gentleman called Roman Sigilin, who I'd never heard of before. We had heard of the Garulas a lot because my grandparents would use that story to teach my brother and me how important it is to be good. Segolin, this is Roman and his sister-in-law, Stanislava, and Stanislava's husband was Roman's brother. They lived together, and they were part of this group that were hiding Jews. Again, they did not have to do this. Most people did not care, or they did horrible things on their own. These people did the right thing. Roman was young. He was 30. We since learned and confirmed that he and his brother would disguise themselves as Jews in order to basically break into the ghetto to get food to people. Just unbelievable, unbelievable heroes. He was arrested as part of this roundup when this happened. He also was tortured for 6 weeks. We learned he was beaten so badly that his own brother reported being unable to recognize him. He also did not give up my grandparents, so I owe him. And he was executed for it as well. The photo in the middle there is my Aunt Tony. At some point during that period of time, actually, she was hidden as an infant, but 3 or 4 by the time my grandparents came back to get her. But I always like to focus on the positive, because there's, the easy part's talking about the negative, but the positive is also very important. So my grandparents survived, and as did their daughter, as well as my Uncle Martin. And my Aunt Sala survived as well. I wanted to make sure that I share her portion. She, as I said, was sent to Siberia as a single mother. I can't imagine what she went through. Her story is just unbelievably harrowing as well. And it gets its own moment. Maybe I'll do that next year. But she sent her two children through Tehran, Iran, and into Israel. She didn't know if they were going to make it. Of course, they were traveling at great risk, but she decided to give up her children so hopefully they could survive. And again, the strength that must come in taking an act like that, I just cannot imagine. But she ultimately, and she told her son, who was just a few years older than his sister, they were little children, I think they were 10 and 7, I believe, do not let go of your sister's hand. And she sent them off with a de facto kind of group that was trying to shepherd Jewish children to Israel. And again, this is before Israel was Israel. But and she would get word every once in a while, but didn't really know. She ultimately reconciled with them in 1946, I believe, right after the war. She found them in Israel. She went there with absolutely nothing as a single mom, and took part in the independence war for Israel in 1948. And actually, when she got there, she needed to work, and her skill set was in cooking. And so she started cooking, and she ended up being the head, I hope I have this right, the head chef or cook for the Northern Front during the Independence War. I mean, she climbed the ladder all the way up to the top, which is very exciting. And ultimately, for a period of her life, moved to New York to be with the rest of our family. And I'll get to that in a second, and open a restaurant there. So she stayed with her passion, which is kind of neat. So she survived and made her way to Israel to be with her children. Wonderful story there. My grandparents, people think the war just ended when the Nazis surrendered, like you flip a light switch or something of that nature. And of course, that's not how the world works. And so there was still rampant anti-Semitism. People were still getting killed. My grandparents were working to try to rebuild kind of de facto governments and that sort of thing, just to rebuild Jewish life in Poland, and trying to figure out what they were going to do with their lives, trying to get into America. And one of the things they were doing was they were helping Jewish orphans find homes. And they ended up getting, I say, in trouble. I mean, they were sort of punished for it. They got more death threats for doing that. And they really needed to get out of Europe. So I then have since learned through the papers that we found from my Uncle Leon and my Aunt Peggy, his wife, that my Uncle Leon and my Aunt Peggy did not even know these people. My Uncle Leon was in the hospital in New York, and his candy striper turned into his wife. He met my Aunt Peggy, they fell in love, and she obviously learns about his family and the despair they're suffering. And they find out that that they survived. And I actually have I have the original letter from the refugee service notifying my Uncle Leon that his family, certain members of his family are alive. A very cherished piece that the museum now has. And he immediately starts working to get them to America. I have letters, lots of letters of rejection. And another lesson in there is don't quit. Because he was, there's way more letters of rejection than approval in the package. And, but he didn't quit, and neither did my Aunt Peggy. And so my grandparents and my Uncle Martin and my Aunt Tony were in late 1940, very late 1947, made their way here. In early mid of 1948, my father was born. So he was born almost right when they got here. They settled in, they were farmers, as I keep saying. They settled on a farm in New Jersey, outside of Atlantic City. And my dad grew up on a chicken farm, because that's what my grandparents did. And but one of those other lessons is they rebuilt themselves. They made a family, and they built themselves from scratch and they were successful. And my grandparents would always say to my brother and me, our story did not end when we survived. Our story keeps going as we thrived. And it's an important and very important lesson. And this is a photo that shows that. From the left, you have my Aunt Peggy, my Uncle Leon, the little guy there with the misbuttoned jacket is my father. My Uncle Martin's behind him. My grandmother has her arm around my father, and then there's my Aunt Tony. And that's at the dedication of those Torah scrolls there. Those were actually saved from the Holocaust. They were, my grandparents' farm had my family's farm had the town synagogue on the farm, and these Torahs were hidden away before they lost their farm, and they came back and they got them and they brought them to America. And my grandparents' kind of only loving rule in this was that these always be used. And my brother and I have them now, and they are used in our synagogue every weekend. And that's victory. You also see my grandparents there, a photo of them together, as well as my father and his sister. And my grandparents have long since passed, but we carry on their legacy and their story. And that's me with my other grandparents. My grandfather, Henry here, was also a survivor. His story gets its own place as well. It's being worked on by the museum because there's still some gaps in it because he wasn't as comfortable telling his story. So the Education and Research Department are doing great work to help us plug the holes of that story. And that little fella there is me. And this is the grandparents I've been telling you about. That is also me, looking like I'm ready to go. But so that's me with them, actually in Florida. And I always like to end with our growing family tree. So that is how I'll end this time too. And I'm always proud to say that's not even, there are names to add to this. I just haven't had a chance to yet because the family continues to grow. So that's the ultimate revenge. So that is certainly the short version, but the version of my family story. And I thank everybody for being here on really such a harrowing, important day for us to really value these lessons. And I thank everybody again for listening. And I hope that my family story and my existence motivate people to do good things every single day, big and small, because that's what was done for me. And that's what I do. So thank you.